Previews of other programs in the Ancient Secrets of the Bible Collector Series follow this presentation. We are about to look into the pages of the first continuous recorded history of mankind in the book we call the Holy Bible. We're going to investigate some of its most controversial stories and discover the answers to some very tough questions. Is the Bible a reliable account of miraculous interventions that rescue people from sudden doom and destruction? Or is it merely a collection of legends and myths, as some modern-day critics claim? Leading experts, both Bible skeptics and proponents from throughout the world, have contributed to the discussion of these biblical questions that may shock and surprise you. Is this the burial cloth that covered the crucified body of Jesus as it was laid in the tomb? Is this cloth a silent witness to the greatest event in history, or is it a fraud? Is a connection between the supernatural and mankind scientifically provable?
What could, from a dead body, create such an image?
Right now, space science may be unlocking the secrets of the Shroud of Turin. Is this the face of Jesus Christ?
There's no question about it. It is an absolute fact that the Shroud is a painting, period.
Anyone who has examined the Shroud up close and personal, the full Shroud, not just a single fibril from it, knows that those pigments have nothing to do with the image.
This mystery is unquestionably the most sensitive, controversial, and emotional enigma in the world today. The Shroud of Turin. Is it the burial cloth that covered Jesus Christ when his crucified body was laid in the tomb? And if it is not, what is it? The modern investigation and controversy over the Shroud began in 1898. A gifted amateur Italian photographer, Segundo Pia, was allowed unprecedented permission by the King of Italy to take the first photograph of the Shroud. When it was spread out for display, Pia was disappointed on seeing that the image on the cloth was extremely faint. But what he caught on his 2 glass photographic plates stunned the world. It showed that the image on the cloth itself was photographically negative. Consequently, the faint, almost ghost-like images on the Shroud appeared in reverse on his camera plates, making them a positive image. It was the first time in history that the likeness could be seen in full, majestic detail.
It measures 14 feet 3 inches long by 3 feet 7 inches wide, which includes a hand-sewn seam added at an unknown date. These full-length dark lines are scorches from the fire that nearly destroyed it in 1532. The diamond-shaped patches cover holes resulting from that fire.
On both sides of the Shroud, we see markings of a vicious flogging from the neck to the calves of the legs. There appear to be markings of wounds that would indicate the man had something with many sharp points pressed onto his head. On the back view, we see shoulders that are badly bruised, as though from carrying something heavy. Nail wounds through the wrists and feet, a distension of the thorax, all of which would seem to indicate death by crucifixion, exactly as the Gospels describe the suffering and death of the man Jesus.
For at least 6 centuries, millions of people have continued to believe that this is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Several studies have also given support to this belief.
Some of the best scientists in the world have observed this image, measured, studied it, and still have no explanation for how the image was formed.
What could, from a dead body in rigor mortis, in a cloth, create such an image?
I feel that the radiation that made the image was a direct result of the resurrection.
It's basically some form of natural phenomenon, or some people might say supernatural phenomenon.
Whatever energy may have created the shroud image is certainly beyond our ability to duplicate at this time.
However, there is some academic opinion which insists this cloth is nothing more than an elaborate medieval fraud.
It is an absolute fact that the shroud is a painting, period. When I started working on it, I expected it to be real. I was hoping it would be real. I can't argue, however, with the microscope. The shroud shows no particles resting on the image fibrils. This proves the shroud could not have been produced by artist pigment.
The shroud image is made from tiny fibers that are 1/10 the size of human hair. And the picture elements are actually randomly distributed like the dots in your newspaper photograph or magazine photograph. To do this, you would need an incredibly accurate atomic laser. This technology does not exist.
Skeptics argue there is no providence, no historical trail tracing the shroud prior to 1353, some 1,300 years between the time it was supposed to be wrapped around Christ's body and its appearance in the church at Lire, France. Where was it all those years? Did it even exist during that period?
Skeptics are completely wrong in insisting that the trail of the shroud goes back only to the middle 1300s. It does, in fact, go back to the Bible itself. The 20th chapter of the Gospel of John, verse 6, states that when Peter entered the tomb of Jesus on Sunday morning, he found the shroud. Now, normally a grave cloth would be considered unclean and not saved. But if it bore the image of the body it had contained, this would explain why it was retrieved by Jesus' followers and treated with great reverence. In fact, a 4th century Syriac manuscript tells us the king of Edessa, a man called Abgar, was cured of leprosy when he received a cloth from a disciple named Jude Thaddeus that had upon it the image of Jesus' face. Probably for disguising the burial cloth, the shroud was placed in a specially made container with gold latticework. And when folded upon itself 4 times, only the image of the head would be seen. And again, for the sake of protection, the caretakers of the shroud did one other thing. They began to refer to it as the mandilion, a Greek term meaning simply towel.
The creation of the mandilion is a most important event. Up to the time of its exhibition in Edessa, 300 years after the crucifixion, there were no realistic pictorial representations of Jesus Christ. With the appearance of the mandilion, the pictorial concept of Christ changed drastically from a beardless youth, like the Greek god Apollo, to what has become the universally accepted version today. There is no doubt amongst experts that what is known as the mandilion of Edessa was a prototype for all the pictorializations of Christ from that day to this.
This early encaustic icon of Christ, produced about 550 AD, and presently located at St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of Mount Sinai, is a highly accurate image derived from direct observation of the facial image on the Shroud of Turin. It has approximately 250 points of congruence with the Shroud image. In a court of law, it takes only 45 to 60 points of congruence to establish a positive identity of the same face. Such congruence points include a small tear from the left eye, chap marks on the lips, and even the image of flowers around the head. This icon shows that the Shroud image was well known at the time and believed to be an authentic image, and hence was used by the iconographers of the Byzantine period for their artistic productions from the 6th century on.
The Shroud, or Mandilion as it was now called, was apparently lost and forgotten until a flood devastated the city of Edessa. It was rediscovered in a niche above the city's west wall. It was returned to a place of veneration where it remained until 944, when the Byzantine emperor sent an army to bring it to Constantinople. We know from Byzantine records that a great celebration and parade accompanied its entry to Constantinople on August the 15th, 944 AD, and it was once again revered as the true and miraculous image of Christ.
In 1204, European knights of the Fourth Crusade stormed and sacked the Christian city of Constantinople.
Dr. Scavone goes on to say that a French knight, Robert de Clary, wrote that he had seen the shroud with the figure of Christ on it, but that after the city fell, the shroud mysteriously disappeared. Many experts believe that the shroud was carried off in secret by the powerful Knight Templars. Then, later when the French king viciously crushed the order of the Templars, one royal knight, Geoffrey de Charnay, took the shroud into hiding in his own castle. And all the Knight Templar martyrs died without revealing the secret.
However, two recently discovered documents state that the shroud was carried to Athens in 1205 by a prominent knight of the Fourth Crusade, Othon de la Roche. Then in about 1353, a distant descendant of Othon, Jean de Vergy, married Geoffrey de Charny, the first certain owner of the shroud at Lyrae. A pilgrim's medallion from about 1356 shows the family crests of Vergy and Charny side by side below the twin image of the shroud, and this suggests an equality of ownership between them.
Geoffrey de Charnay endowed the collegiate church at Lyrae and gave into its keeping the artifact we now call the shroud. 60 years later, the de Charnays reclaimed the shroud, and for another 34 years, Marguerite de Charnay's granddaughter refused to return it to the church, even under the threat of excommunication. Finally, and probably for financial reasons, Marguerite transferred ownership of the shroud in 1452 to the royal family of Italy, the Savoys. In 1532, fire in the Savoy Cathedral at Chambéry in France damaged the shroud. In 1578, the Savoys established their capital in the city of Turin and took the shroud with them where it remains till this day. After 1580, the shroud was rarely exhibited to the public, and then only for short periods, some 11 times in 400 years.
Some of the most critical opinions regarding the shroud's authenticity, both past and present, have come from Christian churchmen, beginning with a French bishop in the medieval year of 1389. Catholic Bishop Pierre d'Arcy was disturbed to hear that the shroud was being exhibited at the collegiate church at Lyrae as a true relic.
Diligent inquiry and examination by my predecessor, Bishop Henri de Poitiers, discovered out the fraud. The reputed relic was nothing but a piece of common cloth, cunningly painted. Bishop de Poitiers had a full confession from the culprit painter himself, for which he immediately ordered a withdrawal of the false relic from public viewing.
The reputed Bishop Darcy letter has never been proved genuine. None of the copies of the Darcy letter that we have is signed or dated. There's also no proof that the Pope ever saw it or that it was even delivered to him.
The Darcy's memorandum could not be introduced as evidence in a court of law because it is neither signed nor dated. There's no evidence that it is in the handwriting of the bishop that is purported to be. It is simply estimated that it is from about 1389. The artist or forger is not named. There is no transcript of any sort of official investigation.
And besides, no trace or hint of identity has ever been found of the artist, who, if he ever made the image on the shroud, would have belonged among the ranks of Michelangelo, Da Vinci, and Raphael.
The image on the Shroud of Turin is negative, meaning that the lights and darks are reversed from the way we would normally see with our eyes. Assuming that the shroud were manufactured in the 14th century, it would mean someone would had to have conceived of the concept of photography approximately 650 years before it was invented. I don't think so.
If the shroud is a fake, it is probably the most astonishing fake of all time. If it is genuine, then it is arguably the first visible evidence of Christ's crucifixion and may literally be a photographic record of his resurrection.
In 1973, the shroud was brought out for a brief examination by a group of European scientists. Among them was the late Dr. Max Frey, a Swiss criminologist and one of the leading experts in dust and pollen analysis in the world. Dr. Frey almost single-handedly developed a technique to determine where criminals had been by testing samples of dust and pollen from their clothing.
Max Frey was a friend of mine and a very good criminalist, and did a lot of work on the shroud with the same sort of tapes that we used. He found pollen grains that came from Palestine and that area. We didn't. On our examination of the shroud, we found very few pollen grains, an average of maybe 1 per square centimeter.
At first, Dr. Frey's objective was simple. If the shroud was forged in France in the 14th century, then only the French or Italian pollens would be found in the cloth. But his exhaustive analysis found some 58 specific pollens, only 17 of which were indigenous to Europe. The rest were from Palestine and southern Turkey, the site of Edessa and Constantinople. And this meant that the shroud had been in these places at some time in its history.
We had noted the presence of other objects on the shroud besides the body, and that we found, to our astonishment, the highly accurate images of many flowers. There are actually many hundreds of these, but we're able to identify 28 species of these flowers with, we feel, a good degree of accuracy. The importance of this is that these flowers all grow either in Jerusalem or within 12 miles of Jerusalem. In addition, the pollens of 25 of these flowers, the 28 that we found, have also been identified independently on the shroud. Whatever produced the image of the body, which some feel is the resurrection, also produced a high-energy field, producing images off every object that was in the shroud itself. And hence we have the highly accurate images of these flowers.
It has been alleged that the type of linen, the herringbone pattern weave, was very rare in the Palestine area, but that it was a very common textile after the 12th century in Europe. This is simply not true. Neither the linen nor the weave were common in Europe. This same pattern is identical to mummy wrappings that go back as far as 2000 BC. Joseph of Arimathea was a wealthy man who received permission from Pilate to bury Christ's body. It is not unlikely that when he gave his tomb for the burial of Christ, he may have also used expensive Middle Eastern linen grave clothes that were intended for his own burial.
The physical shroud itself is one matter for investigation, but even more mysterious and more puzzling is the haunting image which appears on the shroud itself. The shroud may be traceable to the time of Christ, but is it an image of Christ or a painting by a very clever artist, as first claimed by Bishop Darcy and several modern-day scholars?
If it was the shroud of Christ, it would have to be made up of embalming materials and blood and other body fluids. What we found microscopically were pigments, pigments used by an artist, and a paint medium that was commonly used in the Middle Ages. This proves the shroud is a painting, a beautiful painting, but nevertheless the work of an artist.
Walter McCrone believes that the image on the shroud is either a directly painted image or an image perhaps reinforced with artist's pigment. One of the pigments he's identified is iron oxide using optical microscope techniques, but an X-ray fluorescent scan of the entire shroud shows no more concentration of iron in the image areas than there is on the cloth itself. I don't believe the theory because there is so little pigment shown in the image areas on the shroud, and the image itself only consists of degraded cellulose fibrils, which have a yellowish color as viewed by the human eye.
No one has ever disputed the fact that he found real paint pigment on there, but it comes from the fact that when artists made copies of the shroud, they touched it to the shroud to gain sanctity for their creations.
The artist did an excellent job of creating an image that looks to be pretty much anatomically correct. You can find fault with it, the length of the fingers and the length of the arms, but still, artists, even 500 years ago, were able to paint figures that are anatomically correct.
To help determine the possibility of whether the shroud image is a painting, we asked Hungarian physicist and internationally known monumental artist Dr. Isabel Pizik who has studied artist depictions of Christ from the 1st century to the present day. She has also painted over 450 monumental-sized paintings of Christ and other biblical scenes.
The professional arts do not think that the shroud could possibly be a painting. There are certain paradoxes which the professional artist can see looking at the shroud, which cannot be explained and which a professional artist could not have been doing today, yesterday, or in the Middle Ages. The Turin shroud absolutely does not exhibit any kind of outline. About 92 different scientific and scholarly disciplines also testified that this Turin shroud cannot be a painting.
If we are to believe the image on the shroud is a painting, the artist would have had to paint it with a 20-foot-long brush. The image is not even discernible much closer than that distance. If you can't see the image up close, how could you possibly paint it up close?
The experts contend that the molecular paint traces found even in the unimaged shroud areas are simply dust particulates acquired over the years. Equally, they argue the unique effect on the fibril surfaces cannot be produced by any known paint, and far more resemble a radiation burn than any kind of intentional coloration.
The shroud is definitely not a fake or a fraud. Many of today's most distinguished scientists are convinced the shroud is genuine. These scientists not only believe in its authenticity, but they also believe the weight of scientific evidence supports their beliefs.
Since 1977, when the people at Los Alamos National Laboratories first put the shroud into the VP8 analyzer, this instrument has become associated with shroud research. The shroud photos taken in 1931 by Giuseppe Henri were analyzed on this equipment. Many people have sent me images to compare to the shroud. The VP8 analyzer can clearly distinguish a man-made picture from the real shroud image. The slope of a man-made picture is uniform, and it rises to a fixed plateau.
From supermarket art to the world's masterpieces, no painting possesses true three-dimensional qualities, and the VP8 analyzer clearly proves it.
The slope of the image on the shroud is varied and agrees with the shape of a real face. We found that in the shroud's image, there's encoded three-dimensional information, which an artist could not have put there.
A particularly sensitive point of discussion with scientists on both sides of the issue centers around what is said to be bloodstains, according to Dr. John Heller and Dr. Alan Adler. The question is, are the stains actually blood? And if they are, how did they get there?
Heller and Adler reported blood. Whether they found blood, I'm not so sure. They had the same tapes that I had. I had more of them, but they had some as well, and they reported blood. I tested for blood, maybe not by 15 different tests, but by at least half a dozen. I found no blood. I will say categorically there is no blood on the shroud, period.
According to medical physicist Dr. John Heller and blood specialist Dr. Alan Adler, when paint is x-rayed, it shows up quite unequivocally. But these x-rays of the shroud do not show the blood spots, which means that the blood could not be paint. They determined not only that the markings on the shroud were indeed blood, but blood highly loaded with bilirubin, a bile pigment that would only show up if the dead man had been jaundiced or severely and traumatically beaten.
On the other side of the ocean, and working independently of Heller and Adler, the noted pathologist Pierre Bem Ballon came to the further conclusion that the blood spots on the shroud were human and of the type AB. But even if it has been scientifically proven that the image is not a forgery and that the blood is indeed real, what proof is there that this linen cloth is the burial shroud of Jesus Christ? Could a modern forensic pathologist be able to tell anything from an examination of the shroud? Dr. Robert Buckland is a former coroner and forensic pathologist from Los Angeles County. He is well acquainted with images of violent death and is able to tell us much about the shroud from life-size photographs of it.
This is a body of a 5-foot, 11-inch Caucasian male weighing about 170 pounds. On the head, there are blood flows resulting from numerous puncture wounds on the front, the back, and the top of the head. There is a swelling over one cheek consistent with a beating. The right wrist is covered by the left hand, but there is a puncture wound in the left wrist consistent with a crucifixion injury. The classical, artistic, and legendary portrayal of nails through the palms is incorrect because the structures in the hand are too fragile to hold up the weight of a man of this size without tearing free. There are streams of blood running down both forearms, originating in the wrist areas and controlled by gravity, so the blood flows toward the elbows with the arms elevated and outstretched. On the back, there are more than 100 lesions which appear to be scourge or whip marks. Historians have indicated that the Romans used a whip called a flagrum. This implement had 2 or 3 thongs, and at their ends were pieces of metal or bone which look like small dumbbells. Here you can see how those end pieces from a Roman flagrum fit precisely into the scourge lesions on the body. Here on the front of the body is a large blood stain resulting from puncture of the chest by an instrument like a lance or a spear. This weapon penetrated the thoracic cavity through the pleural spaces and into the heart. Later, after the corpse was removed from the cross and turned, blood dribbled out of the chest wound and puddled along the small of the back. There's an abrasion on one knee consistent with a fall. Finally, a spike has been driven through both feet and blood leaked from those areas and has stained the cloth. The evidence of a scourged man who was crucified and who died of postural asphyxia and cardiopulmonary failure is clear-cut.
The coroner's report fits every recorded detail in the Bible account regarding the beating of Christ by the Romans. It matches perfectly with everything we know from the Bible about the death of Jesus Christ.
Impressive evidence indeed that the shroud could be the actual burial cloth of Christ. Even more evidence favoring the shroud's authenticity was forthcoming. In 1978, when the Shroud of Turin was exhibited for only the 4th time in the century, a team of 40 scientists, known as the Shroud of Turin Research Project, using the latest high-tech equipment, examined the shroud for 5 intensive days. During the next 7 years, this tireless group spent 150,000 man-hours studying, testing, and interpreting the data from the shroud, making it the most intensively studied artifact in history. But the shroud advocates received a serious setback when one test, a carbon-14 dating analysis, produced disappointing results. An international news agency report stated that a test performed by scientists in 3 countries indicated that the shroud dated from the Middle Ages, somewhere between the years 1260 and 1390.
The radiocarbon dates that we obtained clearly put the shroud in the Middle Ages.
Carbon-14 is never used as a sole litmus test, and yet the mood of the day seemed to accept the dating without question, and the press leaped to unwarranted conclusions.
Carbon-14 dating is far from an exact science. Freshly killed mollusks show they have been dead for 3,000 years, while bristlecone pine, the oldest trees on Earth, always date too young by 2,000 to 3,000 years. 3 labs were selected to perform the Shroud carbon-14 dating test. They were given 3 linen control samples, samples of a known age, to test the accuracy of their lab testing. One sample was a piece of bull mummy linen, the oldest of the samples and already known to be from 3000 BC. The 3 lab results varied from 3440 to 4517 BC, a variance of 1100 years. On the other samples, the range of error was from 439 to 1500 years off. And the testers defended these errors as due to contamination of the samples. But after extensive retesting, the oldest bull linen sample was still some 1,000 years off.
They really only tested one area. As one guy put it, they didn't do 3 tests. They did 1 test 3 times.
There are simply too many variables that can affect the test results. And besides, the shroud sample takers and their labs violated 14 scientific protocols that were established to ensure test accuracy. Therefore, the results of these shroud tests must be considered suspect.
There are literally thousands of pieces of scientific data which support the conclusion that the shroud is not a fake or forgery. However, only one piece of evidence, the carbon-14 dating, indicates the shroud is of medieval origin. In my professional opinion, the authenticity of the shroud could be proven in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt.
With more than 50 extensive scientific peer tests and studies performed on the shroud, the preponderance of evidence favors authenticity. If only the carbon-14 dating enigma could be resolved, we might know for sure. In the Russian capital city of Moscow, the answer to this enigma is believed to have been found.
Recently, Dr. Dmitry Kuznetsov, an expert from Moscow specializing in physical-chemical research methods, challenged the carbon-14 medieval dating of the shroud. First, Kuznetsov discovered when flax, the linen material of the shroud, is manufactured, certain elements of the original plant, namely waxes and fats, are driven out. This causes the remaining fibers to have a misleadingly high carbon content. Additionally, by duplicating the environment of the 1532 fire in which the shroud was severely damaged, Kuznetsov demonstrated the fire also altered the shroud's carbon-14 content by increasing it. As a result, Kuznetsov claims that the recalculating of the data of the 1988 carbon-14 test, based on the two pieces of new information, establishes the shroud's age at no less than 1900 years, the exact time of Christ.
The Shroud of Turin appears to be a genuine burial cloth from the time of Christ, but it is the image on this cloth from which the final judgment will have to be made. What made it? Whose image is it? How did it get on the cloth and remain still visible after more than 1,000 years?
Whatever the mechanism for forming the image on the shroud, it had to occur in a short period of time, act in an up and down direction, and produce an image intensity determined by the distance between the cloth and the body. One of the theories which seems to satisfy these characteristics is a coronal discharge similar to Kirlian photography or lightning.
One scientist said it's like every pore of the body suddenly fired a miniature laser beam for a split second of time. And so I'm sure that there's some power, some explanation that defies our current understanding.
And I believe that when the body of Christ was raised to that multi-dimension that scientists call in space, that there was a little extra burst of radiation that marked the shroud.
Just maybe God did leave behind a document of the resurrection.
Well, remembering that I'm Jewish, so that I certainly don't have any biases for the cloth, and as a matter of fact was very skeptical at the beginning, I still believe the shroud is authentic because there's really no way to duplicate the quality of the image that we have there today. If you have faith, you don't need the shroud, and if you don't have faith, it's questionable whether you'll be convinced by it. But if it makes you think about it, if it makes you consider it, then it's important.
In the case of Jesus, there were witnesses for every event in his life, from birth to his death on the cross and all the teachings and miracles in between. The one thing that wasn't witnessed, except by an empty tomb, was the resurrection. Wouldn't it be just like God to leave us a photograph on linen of the one event that man couldn't see?
The Shroud of Turin continues to be one of the great mysteries of the modern world, and that makes the shroud newsworthy for tomorrow's headlines as the world anxiously awaits more new findings. Neither the historicity of Jesus' resurrection nor the faith of Christians depends on the Shroud of Turin being the authentic burial cloth of Jesus Christ. However, if it were proven conclusively to be authentic, the shroud would certainly fall in line with hundreds of other pieces of evidence that the Bible is accurate and reliable. Does your faith and all that evidence make you confident in telling others about Christianity? Something to think about.